Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today I would like to talk about fiction. You might remember last week I discussed the three traditional genres of literature: fiction, poetry, and drama, or stage plays. We're going to cover all three of those genres beginning today with fiction, but just keep in mind that these are the traditional genres. These are the traditional definitions, meaning they've been around for a long time, but it might be time that we start to revise some of these definitions and perhaps expand some of these genres or categories. So we can talk more about that as the semester continues. But let's get into fiction. Let's talk about the different types of fiction. I think I mentioned these last week as well, but let's get into more detail about them now, beginning with epics. So when we're talking about fiction, we can talk about epics, usually ancient epics, although they can still be written today. Also, the modern novels that have largely replaced epics, and also short stories or other assorted forms of short narrative fiction. So let's start with epics. This type of fiction really goes back to the very beginnings of literary history, the very beginning of really human civilization. So a lot of ancient cultures had their own epics. The ancient Sumerians had Gilgamesh. The ancient Greeks had the Iliad and the Odyssey. In ancient Rome, you had the Aeneid. So they mentioned some of these in chapter 2. These are all examples of ancient epics, and we categorize these as examples of fiction, types of fiction, even though they are written in verse. And typically, texts written in verse are considered to be poetry. So I mentioned this basic distinction last week. Verse means that the language has several internal forms that are supposed to be maintained. So these might pertain to rhyme scheme, meter, line length, various other things, whereas prose typically does not have as many rules to follow. It's typically a little bit more free-flowing, and it sounds a little bit more like the way people actually talk. So we typically find prose in novels and short stories, and then we typically find verse in poetry. So epics are written in verse, but we categorize them with novels and short stories because they have more in common with novels and short stories when it comes to things like narrative structure, plots, the content of their plots, the way their plots unfold, also characters, and other key characteristics. But I know this is a little bit confusing. Epics are written in verse, but we don't classify them with other types of poetry also written in verse. And the key thing to remember about that really is just the idea of narrative. When we talk about poetry in a couple of weeks, this might make more sense, but typically lyric poetry or lyrical poetry doesn't tell a very in-depth, sort of well-developed narrative. Although there are exceptions, but typically just the nature of lyric poetry means that we're not getting as many narrative elements. We might get some, but we're not getting as many narrative elements as we get in novels, short stories, and epics. So because of those similarities, we consider epics to be in the same genre as novels and short stories, and really we think of them as sort of a forerunner or a predecessor of the modern novel. And we'll talk about some of those links. But you guys probably are at least somewhat familiar with epics. You may have had to read some abridged versions of the Odyssey or the Iliad in school, maybe in high school at some point. So you know that these often revolve around heroes' quests or some type of journey that the protagonist has to go on. Typically, he has to overcome various obstacles, conquer various monsters or adversaries in order to accomplish some goal. But the important thing that they point out in chapter 2 is that epics were very much rooted in the religions, the mythologies, and the histories of the ancient cultures that they came from. And we can track a lot of similarities across all of these different epics from different places, from different cultures. They all have a lot of the same elements, but they're ultimately all expressing sort of all-encompassing worldviews that are sort of representative of their unique time and place. So this is kind of a tricky concept to understand. I'm not sure how effectively the book gets it across, but they're making a distinction here between what epics do and what more modern novels do. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but obviously novels are also quite different. So they say novels typically express a more individualized sort of message or meaning, a more relative message or meaning. And I think we can understand that once we get a little further along. But on the other hand, epics are expressing some all-encompassing worldview that would represent some predominant idea or concept or value that would have been very important to most ancient Greeks or most ancient Romans or ancient Egyptians, whatever culture we're talking about. So that's a distinction that we'll come back to as we talk more about novels. But obviously epics were very popular in ancient cultures. They remained popular throughout sort of the early medieval period. And again, they involve, long, detailed plots, characters. They have a lot in common with what we see in modern novels, so we do think of them as kind of an ancestor of the novel. Another early ancestor of the novel is the romance, and they talk about this a little bit in chapter 2 as well. The romance, that's a broad term that applies to a lot of different sort of adventure narratives that were popular, particularly in the medieval period. Now, some of these were written in verse, and others were written in prose. It kind of depended on what part of the Western world we were in and sort of what literary tradition we were occupying. But typically, romances are similar to epics. They also feature heroes and hero quests, but they are different in a few ways. For one, a lot of romances tended to be a little bit shorter than older epics. So in that way, they kind of anticipated more modern forms of fiction because they would have more focused plots. If you've read any epics, you know that a lot's going on. I mean, there'll usually be a sort of through line, a sort of most important plot line, but there's a lot of characters, a lot of events, and a lot of time gets covered. So romances typically had more focused plots and a little bit more character development because they were a little bit smaller in scope and scale. In terms of the events of their plot, they could maybe zero in on the protagonist a little bit more and develop that protagonist in a little bit more detail. A lot of the characters in ancient epics are kind of flat and uninteresting. And we're going to talk more about the reasons why when we get to character as a sort of element of fiction. Not all characters in epics are boring, but often the protagonists are, because they're more symbolic than anything. They're not really supposed to be representations of like realistic people. So that begins to change a little bit with medieval romances. You start to get slightly more three-dimensional, complex characters that get developed a little bit more. But in a lot of ways, romances are also a lot like epics. But yeah, a little bit smaller in terms of the plot, so we can be a little more tight and focused with our plot structure, and we get more character development, a little bit more individualizing. That's a term we see a lot in chapter 2. Characters being made into sort of recognizable individuals with a lot of different character traits. We also see that romances are very episodic, which means, we have a lot of sort of individual episodes that are somewhat self-contained, but they usually feature some of the same characters, and they sort of contribute to this overall plot development. And we usually see a linear plot. We're usually moving in chronological order. So, again, similar in many ways to epics, but they're pushing narrative prose fiction a little bit further, a little bit closer to the modern age. And we also notice that in traditional older epics, we almost always have an omniscient third-person narrator. And omniscient just sort of means all-knowing, godlike. So we have, narrators that know everything, and they can relay a lot of information to readers. In romances, we start to get different types of narration styles, slightly different points of view. So we'll talk more about point of view as another key element of fiction, but we start to see a little bit more of sort of individualized perspectives from specific characters. So we don't always get that omniscient third-person narrator that was a staple of the older epics. So these are some older forms of prose fiction that help to sort of lay the groundwork for what we think of today as the modern novel. Like I said, romances were popular throughout medieval Europe. And there was a particular type of romance called the chivalric romance. Some of you might be a little bit familiar with it. It hasn't completely gone away. But these are basically stories or legends, narratives about warriors or knights, executing this type of hero's quest, saving people, accomplishing things, vanquishing monsters or villains. So we've kind of maintained certain elements of that plot and certain elements of that character type, even in very different works of fiction. And even today, we still sort of like medieval settings. They just did another movie remake of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So that's an example of a chivalric romance that's been retold ever since it debuted, like back in the 1300s or whatever. So if you guys are familiar with that text, maybe some of you read it in school, I recommend the movie version. It's weird, but kind of a cool take on what is by now a very familiar, pretty famous story. But again, that's a good example of a chivalric romance. So they remain popular up until the early modern period. But in some ways, novels help to displace the romance sort of from the literary marketplace, if you will. Because, of course, literature is business along with being art. But one thing a lot of scholars have pointed out is that, the novel really owes a lot to the romance. They are different, and the novel kind of helps shove the romance out of its perch as being one of the most popular forms of literature, one of the most popular type of texts, but they do share a lot in common. So the novel really begins to emerge, at least in the Western world, what we think of as novels kind of in the Western world, beginning in the 17th century in Spain. So that means the 1600s. And there's a title many of you are probably familiar with, even if you have not read the book, and that's Don Quixote, written by Miguel de Cervantes in I want to say the early 1600s. So that's given as an early example of a modern novel, and it's really appropriate in terms of subject matter, because if you've read the book or if you know anything about it, maybe you've seen some of the many movie adaptations that exist, but it's about this sort of nobleman who lives alone and he loves chivalric romances, and he just sits around and reads them all the time, and they've kind of made him deranged. They've kind of made him lose his mind. He thinks that he's living in a chivalric romance, and he thinks that he's one of these knight heroes who's supposed to go on a quest and rescue a damsel, etc., etc. So it's largely a comic novel. We're largely invited to make fun, to laugh at that character as he gets into all of these ridiculous situations, and he's often made to look a fool. But sort of one of the larger meanings or messages of the book is Cervantes is sort of saying we need to put aside these chivalric romances because they're so old-fashioned. The book is largely about how things are changing, how, modernity is changing the nature of society, so it's also changing the nature of literature. So the whole book is sort of making fun of these old romances that people still liked and read in the 1600s, and he's sort of saying, that's old, that belongs to an older time, we're modernizing and we're sort of entering a new time. And that's what the novel largely came to represent. The novel is often associated with this sort of rise of modernity. And this is not a history class, so we won't get too far into this, but you guys already you already know some of these, some of this story, some of these big events that helped to modernize the world, frankly. I mean, the novel sort of coincides with the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, the growth and development of an educated middle class, the rise of capitalism, more leisure time for this educated middle class. And what are they going to do in their leisure time? Well, often read, since there was no TV or, iPhones back then. So all of this stuff is going on at the same time. So the novel is a more modern writing style. It exhibits more modern writing techniques, as we're going to see, and it sort of captures, in certain ways, a more modern worldview, if that makes sense, versus what kind of epics and romances were doing. The novel's doing something a little bit different, more appropriate, more fitting for the modern world. So by the 18th century, the 1700s, the novel had become big in England. And by the 19th century, this is really a remarkable rise, a remarkably fast rise. By the 19th century, only a few hundred years after it really began as a writing genre in Europe, it had kind of become the most popular type of literature by the 1800s or the early 1900s. In some ways, it had surpassed poetry, which had long been perhaps the most popular, and epics had previously been very popular, but novels kind of ascended to the top spot, and it only took a few hundred years. So, as the book says, when we're talking about sort of modern innovations in writing, new things, new developments, new breakthroughs, yeah, there's some of that in poetry, but a lot of that took place within the novel. As novels grew and developed over the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, that's where a lot of the really major developments in all of literature have taken place over the last few hundred years. So, again, just think a little bit about the novel along with modernity. All of those things I mentioned, how it's growing up at the same time that the world is kind of changing. A lot of people are leaving farms for cities. More people are educated. More people can read. Again, more people are reading at home. Travel becomes a little easier. We're living in a period now across the 17, 18, into the early 1900s. This is a time of great technological advancement, medical breakthroughs, all kinds of new inventions, and the novels right alongside of all of that. So, again, the old ancient epics and the romances, they relied really heavily on symbolism and allegory. You guys might be familiar with the term allegory. They mention it in the book a few times. An allegory is a narrative or a story in which all the characters, all the events are essentially metaphorical. They're symbolic. They represent larger truths. So the importance isn't so much in the story itself. It's more about what larger eternal truths about God or man or about this particular culture or society might be revealed through these characters and through these events. So everything within the text has this sort of larger meaning, this larger significance where they're representing things or ideas that are outside of the text. So, that was pretty common in ancient societies and throughout the Middle Ages. A lot of medieval plays were very religious and allegorical in nature. So the characters were flat, the plots were predictable, but what the play was expressing was some truth that could be found in the Bible or some important value or belief that would have been, familiar to audiences during that time period. That was largely the point of a lot of these texts, was to communicate these larger truths or these shared worldviews. Like I mentioned earlier, these shared worldviews that not every single person in the culture would have shared, but a lot of them would have. It would have been sort of, this larger message that would have rang true. But everything in the text would have been heavily symbolic and very representational. And that's how all fiction works to an extent. But when it's largely allegorical, like I just said, that often results in characters that aren't very realistic and plots that might be very predictable without a lot of real surprise, because everything's geared towards that larger representation or that larger message. But with novels, things are changing. Novels were striving to be more realistic. They were striving to try to capture life as it really was. They weren't necessarily always trying to express some larger truth or, the characters and events weren't always supposed to symbolize some larger shared value, although some novels do that. But oftentimes they're just trying to show reality in all of its messiness. And when it comes to characters, they're trying to show more individualized, realistic characters. So not simply characters that represent types or larger ideas like we would have seen in epics or maybe romances, but characters that seem like real people. They're complex. They have good qualities and bad qualities. So novels have slightly different intentions, slightly different goals, and certainly a lot of different techniques. So they list several types of kind of popular forms of novels, popular types of novels. We could even call these genres of novels, if that's not confusing. So we have our major genres of literature, and then within each one of those, we have several different types of that genre. So we have different types of fiction, and then within that, we can even make smaller subcategories. So within fiction, obviously, novel is one of the types of fiction, but then there are many different types of novels. So we don't have to memorize all of these or become experts in all of these, but it's important to be familiar with a few of the most popular types of novels because a lot of them are still around today. A lot of them are still with us. So we're actually very familiar with these, whether we know it or not. So the book begins with the picaresque. Or in other words, a narrative about a rogue or a renegade. This also originated in Spain, this type of novel. We can find sort of early examples dating back to the 1500s, and then by the 1700s, this type of novel had made its way over to England. So an early example of an English language novel, a book called Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, that's often held up as a pretty famous example of a picaresque novel. So these rogue type characters are usually at odds with society in some ways. The picaro or the rogue is usually like a petty criminal or just sort of a rascal, a character who doesn't follow the rules, often finds him or herself in trouble. But these characters are often likable, charismatic, and these books are often satirical, sort of comical in nature. The book mentions satire a lot, so I'll just give you guys a quick working definition in case you're not familiar. A satire is just a type of comedic writing that's usually sort of making fun of certain aspects of society in order to maybe fix those things. There's usually kind of a reform-minded aspect that goes along with satire. So with a satire, you're making fun of stuff in the hopes that maybe you can improve these problems that you're sort of humorously pointing out. So a lot of picaresque novels are satirical in that, yes, the rogue is corrupt and maybe criminal, but oftentimes we're led to see that the larger society is too. So the larger society is just as corrupt as the rogue, and sometimes that's funny, or sometimes there's a larger message there. But again, we still see works of fiction like this. I mean, you might be able to think of movies or shows or books you've read where there's a lovable rogue in the middle of the action, and that's, kind of the basic idea of the picaresque. Another really common type that we still see today is the Bildungsroman, also known as the coming-of-age story, or the novel of education. So we should all be familiar with this type of novel. We're usually following a character as that character grows up. So we might not be following him or her for, their entire life, but often we start in childhood and then we watch the character develop and grow. And we might follow that character into early adulthood or maybe into middle age, if not old age. So again, you can probably think of examples of Bildungsroman text that you've read or watched. You might have at least seen some elements of this. Coming of age, watching a character mature. This usually includes a lot of important first experiences, a certain amount of disillusionment as the character sort of meets with disappointment, but also a sense of hopefulness as this person embarks on their life, and there's adventure and all kinds of novelty. So again, we still see these, like these still get made, these still get written, they haven't gone away. Same deal with the historical novel. We should all be familiar with historical novels, even if you're not really a fan of that particular type of novel. But we know what it is, basically. I mean, these are novels based on, at least loosely based on, real events, real historical occurrences. And often the characters in those books will also be at least loosely based on real people. Maybe some of the characters will be, and maybe some of the other characters are just purely, figments of the author's imagination. But these are not works of history, obviously. So the authors might take historical events, they might even take real life people, but they'll fictionalize them. They will make up some of the details. They'll add maybe some embellishments or whatever to make it an entertaining, work of fiction. But the history is an important part of these novels. So this became popular sort of in the early 1800s in England. Sir Walter Scott wrote a series of historical novels like Rob Roy and Waverley. They mention, I think, Waverley in the book. That kind of helped kick off the genre as an established sort of recognized type of novel. And again, they remain popular today, over 200 years later. Now, the epistolary novel, it's not gone. It hasn't gone away. I don't think we see it as often in the modern day, but there are exceptions. It might be considered a little bit old-fashioned, though. An epistolary novel is a novel consisting of letters. Often there'll be letters written by the protagonist. This will often be delivered in a first-person point of view. So you'll have a protagonist writing certain letters to maybe friends or family, and then that character will also be receiving letters from other characters. So the entire plot unfolds through these letters. And that was a very popular type of novel back in the 1700s. So some of those early novels being produced in the English-speaking world, being produced in the British Isles, and then a little bit later in the U.S., many of them were epistolary novels. And some of them were also picaresque novels. So those were two popular early genres. So you see examples of a lot of those back in the 1700s, both picaresque and epistolary. Again, you still might find some epistolary novels today, but they probably are less common. Then the book mentions utopian and science fiction novels, kind of lumping those terms together. This is a little bit imprecise, perhaps. They mention utopian novels in Thomas More's famous early novel, Utopia, which I think dates back to the 1500s. Sometimes that is held up as a very early example of a novel in the English language tradition. I'm not quite sure if it is a novel or if it matters much one way or the other. It's definitely in prose. It's definitely an extended narrative. But some people also think it sort of kicks off the sci-fi genre. So again, you guys know sci-fi. Just keep in mind, they don't mention this in the book, but science fiction is often categorized as a type of speculative fiction. Maybe you've heard that term, sometimes called genre fiction, sometimes called speculative fiction. This would include science fiction, fantasy, horror, other works of fiction that might involve, a lot of elements of the supernatural, or even superhero narratives might be considered in some cases to be speculative fiction. So this is sort of a larger category that's sometimes used to contain sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and some others. We don't necessarily have to use that categorization in here, but it might be useful because it's increasingly being used today. But they don't mention it in the book. Also, they mention Gothic novels and detective novels. These are two other genres that really remain with us today. Now, I would argue that traditional Gothic novels were sort of the ancestor or the forerunner of contemporary horror in a lot of ways. Contemporary horror fiction owes a lot to the Gothic literature of the 17 and 1800s. So they talk a little bit about the Gothic. You guys, again, are probably familiar with the term, even if you haven't read much about it. We're typically talking about narratives here that involve the supernatural or unusual occurrences. They rely very heavily on atmosphere, spooky stuff, haunted castles, dark, stormy nights. Often the undead might factor in curses, magic, spells, maybe even. So we've all kind of encountered some of these elements. And a lot of modern horror, it borrows pretty liberally from a lot of older Gothic novels. And I would argue that in some ways, Gothic, the Gothic style kind of became what we think of now as horror, like a novel like Dracula, which was written in the 1890s. It's often categorized as a Gothic novel. We certainly have the spooky castle. We have a lot of the atmospherics in place. But it's also, by our definition today, it's clearly a work of horror. And all the film adaptations we see, those are horror movies. So the Gothic is closely related to what we think of as horror, so that should make it familiar to us. Think about Edgar Allan Poe, a great U.S. writer who really helped to pioneer the Gothic, a lot of the Gothic techniques. But again, this probably started in the 1700s, largely in England, and then it kind of migrated to the U.S. And then finally, detective fiction. Again, I don't need to explain this to you guys. Think Sherlock Holmes, which was a character created by Arthur Conan Doyle in the late 1800s. Talk about a genre that's still very popular today. Just take a look at all the cop shows and all the films that take as their protagonists detectives. So we still have a lot of detective fiction in our popular culture. Of course, certain techniques and conventions have changed over the years. It's a little bit different now than it was back when Doyle was writing Sherlock Holmes, but a lot of the elements are still in place. The dogged but perhaps tortured detective who has some kind of personal problem, the boss or the chief who doesn't understand, the voice of reason found in the partner, the long-suffering spouse. A lot of that hasn't really changed over the last 200 years or so. Detective stories really started to appear at the end of the 1700s, largely in France. But Poe and some other writers helped to really accelerate this type of novel or this type of fiction, because Poe mostly wrote short stories, sort of in the early to mid 1800s, and it's been very popular ever since. But just a final thought on these genres of novels. Just keep in mind that these boundaries between them are not set in stone. They're very blurry boundaries. So a lot of books will actually incorporate multiple genres. So some Bildungsroman might also be classified as picaresque novels. A science fiction novel can also contain elements of these other genres. It could also be a Bildungsroman, or a detective story could contain Gothic elements, or it could contain some of the elements found in the other genres. That's pretty typical, and I'm sure you guys can think of some examples of shows or movies or books that sort of combine or mix genres. That's very common in the modern day. All right, so let's catch our breath and move on to the short story. So we've already covered epics, and I think we've pretty much done justice to novels. So now let's move on to short stories, really the youngest, the newest form of fiction that we're going to cover. Short stories have really only been around since the early 1800s. So they're even a little bit newer than novels. But as the book points out, some of the predecessors of the short story have been around for a very long time. So much like the epic, the short story kind of harkens back to our old, really old roots in oral literature. So I think I mentioned this a little bit in week 1, maybe when we were talking about the cave paintings and some sort of pre-writing forms of narrative or storytelling or art. So in addition to prehistoric cave paintings, we're also pretty sure that oral storytelling predates most writing. So even with some of these ancient epics that we've discussed, like in ancient Greece, we're pretty sure that those were probably recited orally, and in some cases there might have even been some musical accompaniment, and only later were they written down. So, of course, oral storytelling does not go away with the invention of writing. It remains in a lot of different forms in a lot of different cultures. So this remains true throughout the Middle Ages, even up into the early modern period, and even today we still have forms of oral storytelling. But short stories are a little bit similar to certain kind of old tales or brief narratives that probably would have been primarily told out loud. So, fairy tales or legends or certain myths. We even see little self-contained narratives within the Bible or other older works that could perhaps be considered as short stories. But by our, modern definition of short story, we're only looking back about 200 years into the past. And U.S. writers really played a large role in popularizing short stories, unlike epics and poetry and novels, which all kind of took off before we became an independent nation. We actually got to play a little bit of a bigger role. Certain U.S. writers like Washington Irving and Poe played a very big role in the popularization of the short story. So, but they also mention in the book a few what they call sort of narrative cycles from the early modern period. So right at that bridge as the Middle Ages are ending and modernity or the modern age is kind of coming on. So they mention Canterbury Tales by Chaucer as an example of, again, sort of this is a collection of stories. They're all kind of related in a way, but they're all sort of self-contained narratives. So that's another sort of forerunner of the modern short story. But as they began to develop, they really sort of were somewhat contemporaneous with novels and other aspects of sort of modernity, like newspapers. We haven't talked about newspapers much, but perhaps some of you wrote about news articles for Alternative Media number 1. Newspapers sort of develop along with novels and short stories over the course of the 17 and 1800s. So a lot of historians think that even though they're different, that newspapers were very influential on those forms of fiction. And, again, they shared space in certain cases. They shared certain traits or certain elements. But a lot of newspapers and magazines would publish short stories. And as the book points out, that continues to be the case today. The New Yorker still runs short stories. A lot of magazines publish short fiction. That's kind of been true for, almost 200 years. So as we can tell, based on their shorter length, short stories cannot do everything that novels do. They can't provide quite as much character development. Their plots are usually going to be a little bit simpler, a little bit less complex. And often, because of their shorter length, short stories will focus on a single action or sort of a single event or a single figure, a single location. And all the action sort of revolves around that singular thing. That's not always the case. And some short stories can be pretty long. I mean, you might come across a 50, 60, or 70 page short story that, can develop things in more detail. But typically we're focused on sort of shorter plots and maybe one singular thing, one moment, one place, one key event that we can really zero in on. Also, with a novel, you can kind of have a slow wind up as we work our way up to the climax, and we'll talk more about climax and plots in general once we get to plot as our first key element of fiction. But in a short story, you can't have that same sort of slow wind up. So you might actually start pretty close to the peak of the action, pretty close to that climax. You might start in the middle. That's actually a particular technique, to start in the middle of a narrative. Or maybe you start near the end because you have a more condensed time frame, so you can't take your time the way you would in a novel. So obviously, yeah, we're going to get a little bit less development with our characters, maybe a little bit less description overall, and often just one single point of view. With some novels, we might shift from, between different points of views, different perspectives from different characters. But typically in short stories, we're going to stick with one perspective, one point of view. So those are some pretty obvious differences. And then just very quickly to mention the novella, another type of extended prose narrative. A novella is going to be a little bit longer than a short story, but not as long as a novel. So there are different rules and different sort of page cutoffs as far as when a short story becomes a novella. My general rule of thumb is once you get around 100 pages, you've left the realm of the short story and you've entered the realm of the novella. So the novella might be a little bit under 100, a little bit over 100, but once you get up to about 150 pages, that's a novel. So that's typically how a lot of people look at it, but a very famous example of a novella is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is around that length that I just defined. I think it's a little over 100 pages. So sometimes the novella is that term is sort of used interchangeably with novelette, which they mention in the book, or short novel. So we probably won't see, you don't really see a ton of fiction this length, but they're out there. And like I said, there are some famous examples. Okay, so the next part of our reading covers some of these key elements of fiction. So I think we're going over 4, and we all know what these terms mean. You've probably learned about these terms at a certain point in your previous educational experiences, but I don't know that we've gotten very in-depth about them. So I want us to sort of use the definitions provided by the book, and I'll try to provide some additional explanations because some of these terms and some of these definitions in the book are a little bit difficult. But let's start with plot because it's pretty easy to understand. Most of us know what a plot is. We're simply talking here about the events of a text, the events of the narrative. How do those events unfold in the text? So typically we have sort of a traditional plot structure that's been in use for a long time. It's not set in stone. Not everybody has to use it, but when we're talking about novels, when we're talking about plays, and typically when we're talking about movies, we see this basic plot structure. It's very traditional. Again, remember that. So maybe we can revise it a little bit, and we'll notice certainly that some texts do not follow this completely, but it is very common. So we start with exposition. And if you turn to page 18 in your book, they sort of show you this. They give you the little diagram that you need. So we start with exposition. That's basically all of the information that you, the reader or the viewer, needs in order to get started with this story. So exposition usually occurs at the beginning, and it might come in the form of the narrator telling us things about our setting, about our main characters, and about just sort of what's going on generally in this fiction world, this fictive world that we're in. If it's a movie, maybe we get a narrator, or maybe this is just revealed through characters. Maybe it's just revealed through dialogue, or maybe we get some establishing shots that show us where we are. We're in the suburbs. Here's a house. Here are some cars. Here's the school letting out. Sometimes visuals can do a lot of this work. But basically, we're getting situated. We're getting situated in this fictive world. Here are the people. Here's the place that we're located in. Here's what's going on. So this information is usually provided at the beginning of a plot. There might not be a whole lot of it, but usually there's at least a little bit of it before things really get moving. Next, our next stage is going to be conflict or some kind of complication. So virtually every story is going to have some kind of conflict. This doesn't have to be a fight between two human characters, although that's a pretty common form of conflict. There are all kinds of different conflict. Some conflict is internal. It might take place between a character and that same character. Like it might be all in that character's head. It might be the character versus society. It might be a character versus nature, like the elements, natural disasters or something. There are lots of different conflicts, but typically that conflict will be introduced in some way. So if the exposition gets us situated, gets us sort of comfortable in this world, then we need a complication or we need some development of a conflict to come along and make things a little bit less comfortable and a little bit more dramatic, because that conflict is going to drive most of the remaining plot. So we have to have something. It can be a small scale conflict, it can be a war, it can be virtually anything, but it needs to get introduced and made plain. It needs to be sort of provided for the audience. So that's going to be usually around the midway point, maybe a little before, maybe a little after. But next, we're going to have the climax. So this is the highest point of tension. This is sort of the boiling point of that conflict, of that complication. So a lot of people think the climax comes at the very end, but it usually doesn't. It doesn't come at the very end, it comes near the end. We're definitely in the second half of the movie. We're definitely in the second half of the novel. We're getting close to the end, but we're not all the way to the end. But the climax is the turning point. It's that pivotal point where the balance of power is going to shift, or we're going to see if our character emerges victorious on this journey or this quest. It's the moment of highest tension, highest drama, and a lot's typically decided at that point with the climax. And then after the climax, we have the resolution. So this is where we tie up the loose ends. This is everything that comes after the climax. So typically the resolution will be pretty brief. It's going to vary from text to text, but this is sort of the characters coming to terms with the climax. Maybe relationships are being repaired, maybe changes are being made as a result of the climax. So with a lot of stories that are trying to provide closure, and as we know, not all narratives are trying to provide closure, but the ones that do, they typically have a pretty pronounced, well-defined resolution where it's like, okay, here's what's going to happen. These two are going to get married. This one's going back to school. This one's going to quit his job. She's going to do this. He's going to do that. Here's how they feel. Here's how they're, coming to terms with what's happened. So we kind of know everything has been tied up and there's no loose ends at the end of the text. But we're going to see texts where there isn't much of a resolution. And like I said, we're going to notice that certain works of fiction do not follow all of those stages, all of those traditional plot stages. And certainly with short stories, we're going to notice that in some cases, we just don't have time to cover all of those. So some short stories might do away with exposition. Like I mentioned, sometimes we're just dropped right into the middle of the action without much explanation, without much background info. We're just in it. So maybe we see that, or maybe we see the resolution getting lopped off. That can also happen. But even in really short narratives, we're going to need some kind of conflict, and there is typically some kind of climax, but they can take a lot of different forms. All right, so hopefully that makes sense with plot. And just keep in mind that there's always a sequence to every plot. So the most traditional, typical sequence would be chronological, moving from earliest to latest, going from first to last, sort of moving in a linear, forward-moving progression. That's typically what we see with older kinds of fiction, like epics and romances. And with a lot of novels, we also see it. With a lot of short stories, we also see it. But we've also probably experienced some texts, maybe some movies or shows that do not abide by a linear chronological time sequence. We might see flashbacks where we go back in time. We might see flash forwards where we go forward in time. We might also see examples of foreshadowing where we're given some kind of, often an image or some kind of a suggestion of something that's going to happen later in the plot. So those are examples of breaking that linear chronological progression. Now, some works of fiction do this a lot. Some works of fiction really mess with the time sequence quite a bit, and the audience is constantly jumping around from different in between different points in time. And then other texts, there might be like one flashback or one example of foreshadowing, and then otherwise we're pretty much following that linear chronology. So just be aware of how the text that you're reading or watching, just be aware of how the plot is unfolding. Is it linear or is the time being fractured in various ways? So hopefully that's enough for plot. Let's move on to characters. Now, you guys know what characters are. These are the people who inhabit the texts, to put it simply. So generally speaking, characters can be either flat or they can be round. Flat characters are really character types. They're not developed. They're not made to be individuals. They're really representative of larger groups or classes of people. So you remember when I was talking about epics, I said a lot of the protagonists of epics and even a lot of romances, they weren't always super interesting because they're not round characters. They're types. They're heroes. So they don't have a lot of interiority. They're not super complex. Now, some of the supporting characters might be, but a lot of those protagonists in the older types of fiction, they would have been types. They would have been flat, not really developed, and they don't have a lot of interior stuff. We don't really have a lot of access to their thoughts or their feelings or their innermost desires, although there are exceptions to that. But typically we see flat characters in epics. But with novels, we increasingly see round characters. Like I mentioned, characters that are more realistic. They're more individualized. They might remind us of people that we actually know, or people who, maybe even ourselves, because there's a wide variety of different character traits. Flat characters are typically defined by their predominant trait. Bravery, treachery, whatever. But round characters have a lot of traits. Some good, some bad, some in between. And that's what we typically think of as being a more realistic way of depicting people. So with flat characters, we're going to see a lot more sort of dynamic qualities. And again, we associate with round characters, we're going to see more dynamic characters, more interesting characters, and we associate those more with modern works of fiction. So as the book said, novels really help to bring about a higher level of individualization when it comes to specific characters. We began to see a little bit of that with some of those chivalric romances, but it really becomes more common in novels. So they also mentioned the two primary ways of kind of revealing character. Characters can either be told, they can be revealed through telling, or they can be revealed through showing. And I think we already get this. When a character is largely revealed through telling, that means that the narrator is sort of presenting this character to the audience. And the narrator's description and presentation of that character is going to have a big influence on how audiences perceive the character. Whereas if a character is largely shown through the actions or words of the character without any real interference from the narrator, then that's kind of a more objective way for readers to meet characters. If we meet characters just largely through hearing them and watching them do things. So just be aware of that basic difference. Sometimes narrators literally introduce characters, and then other times characters are sort of allowed to speak for themselves. So that's the distinction that the book is making there. So I think that's pretty good for characters. We know that the protagonist is the main character, does not have to be the hero. Simply means that it's the main character, it's the character we spend most of our time with. And then of course we have an antagonist, but that does not have to be a villain, and it does not even have to be a person. It's just typically a person or thing or force that's standing between the protagonist and what the protagonist hopes to achieve or hopes to gain by the story's end. All right, so let's move on to narrative situation. Now, this one's a little bit tricky. I wanted to spend some time on this, and then I'll just sort of fly through setting, and then we'll wrap up for the week. But I can understand if some of you were struggling a little bit with the way the book presents narrative situation. Even just that term or that phrase sounds a little bit strange. What is a narrative situation? We can also think of this element of fiction as point of view. POV. Some of you may have heard that term or learned that term in the past. So along with plot and character and setting, we can just say point of view instead of narrative situation. But we can also use narrative situation and point of view interchangeably because, as far as I'm concerned, they essentially mean the same thing. So the book really gets more in depth with narrative situation or point of view than I think we need to. But we do need to understand the major types of point of view that we're likely to find in fiction. So I want to go through the three main types that the book lists, starting with authorial narrative situation. Authorial narrative situation. It's really a mouthful. This just means an omniscient third-person narrator. I don't really know why the author of this book wants to use really different terminology for point of view, but all we're talking about with this first type, for authorial, we mean an external narrator. That's not a character, not a part of the action, but rather external, outside of the events of the plot, and seemingly above the events, because this is a godlike narrator. An omniscient narrator, that just means an all-knowing narrator. So this kind of narrator can give us virtually unlimited info. This kind of narrator can give the readers introductions to characters, plenty of exposition, plenty of explanation, whatever else we might need. So look at the examples that they offer. I think we have a passage from Tolstoy, maybe War and Peace. He's using a sort of classic, traditional, omniscient, third-person narrator that knows everything. Conceivably knows what all the characters are thinking, what all the characters are doing. Now, in a lot of cases, we're not always going to have a fully omniscient narrator. Some omniscient narrators can only really get inside the heads of the protagonists. But those are narrators that are still going to play a big role in the text because those narrators are often directly addressing readers, talking directly to us about characters or about plot points in this particular text. So just kind of be aware of what they mean. These are omniscient, third-person narrators that are outside the story and they kind of know everything. So when we see that style, typically we're going to get a lot of info, and the narrator might almost function like a character. The narrator might have a unique voice, maybe even a sense of humor, and we might come to think of the narrator as another character, different from the characters in the action, but it's another presence that has a big influence on us as audience members. Okay, so the next type they discuss is first-person narrative situation. This one's easy to understand. We're just talking about first-person narration, which means I did this, I did that. So here the narration is provided usually by the protagonist, by the main character. So this is a very typical style. We've all seen examples. But sometimes first person or this type of narrative situation might also come from a minor character. Like the book says, not necessarily the protagonist, but maybe a less important character that is a part of the action, not external to the action, like the omniscient third-person narrator, but not the protagonist, not one of the main characters. And this is less common, but we do see examples of this sort of weird type of first-person narrative situation. We do see some examples in some very famous works of American literature. So if, for example, in Moby Dick, Ishmael is a minor character who also serves as the narrator. He's present for pretty much everything, and he delivers the actual narration. Also in The Great Gatsby, we have Nick Carraway, another minor character who serves as the first-person narrator. So, again, we're getting the first-person narration, but not from the protagonist, from somebody else. But this is somebody who observes a lot and is present for a lot of the action involving the other more major characters. So we still get a lot of those scenes. And then finally, the most difficult one to understand is their third category, figural narrative situation. So this basically means that we have a third-person narrator, but this narrator doesn't seem omniscient like the first category, and the narrator doesn't even seem to really be there at all. So the narration is being provided by some kind of third-person narrator, but the narrator's very much in the background. The narrator is hard to see. Can barely be observed in the text. So what you need to realize about this type of point of view, this type of narrative situation, is it's pretty new. This third category really comes along mostly in the 20th century, along with novels of that period. So this hasn't been around as long as omniscient third-person narrators or obviously first-person narrators. So if you go back to those ancient epics, we usually see omniscient third-person narrators, godlike narrators. We see first-person narrators going all the way back to early novels. A lot of those epistolary novels, or maybe a Bildungsroman, would often be told from the perspective of the narrator. So those from the perspective of the protagonist, who is also the narrator. So those types of point of view have been around for a very long time, but the figural narrative situation is a little bit more of a recent development, a more modern invention. So as the book points out, these are third-person narrators, but they're not like omniscient third-person narrators. So the book thinks it's really important that we distinguish those omniscient third-person narrators from the more sort of invisible, non-omniscient, more limited third-person narrator. So I don't know if that's as important as Mario Clarer, the author of the book, seems to think, but I will admit it's kind of interesting to reflect on how we often teach these concepts to younger students, because I'm teaching 101 right now and we're doing our narrative unit, but I'm making it a lot simpler than what we are doing in here in a 200 level class. So in 101, when we talk about point of view, we just talk about first person and third person. And when we talk about third person, we do mention that, okay, there's some omniscient third person narrators, and then there's other third person narrators who aren't omniscient. But we still lump them all together under the same category. Here, we're not doing that, because for Claire, it's not so much, oh, is it first or is it third? It's more about the effect that gets created. And he's saying that with an omniscient third-person narrator, that creates a very particular effect for readers in terms of the information we get and the way characters are presented to us. Whereas in the figural narrative situation, it's very different. The experience, the effect is very different, even though it is still a type of third-person narration. So look at the examples they provide from Crime and Punishment, and I think another one from a book by Kafka, to sort of see what they mean with this third category. So oftentimes with a figural narrative situation, the narrator sticks to just the basics, just like narrating the basic actions of characters. We don't really get access to internal states. We don't get access to inner thoughts. We don't get commentary. We don't get a lot of information. We don't get a lot of background. We just get the bare bones. What the character is doing, the actions or maybe the words of the character, and that's it. So when you guys start reading some examples of fiction next week and you're reading the short story by Hemingway, pay attention, because he's using this kind of figural narrative situation. He's using a third-person narrator, but we can barely even notice that narrator in the story because the narrator does not really introduce characters in any amount of real detail. Doesn't offer us a lot of additional info, doesn't fill in a lot of the blanks, doesn't give us backstories on all the characters, doesn't really talk much about the setting. We just get bare bones, right? This person is sitting here, this person says this. Almost everything in that story is revealed through the actions and the words of the characters. So the narrator isn't playing a big role, even though there is a third-person narrator. So you guys can see the difference. An omniscient third-person narrator kind of announces himself all the time. And again, that narrator might even feel like a character to a certain extent, because we kind of get to know that narrator and we hear from that narrator quite a bit. And that narrator might influence the way that we feel about certain characters or certain events of the plot. Whereas this kind of figural narrative situation has a narrator that does not want to be involved beyond what it has to do. It's only providing the basics and then it's getting out of the way. So it's not really influencing us or impacting us the same way an omniscient narrator would, or the same way a first-person narrator would. So we don't have to be experts on narrative theory, but we do need to know the differences between those three narrative situations, or those three different kinds of point of view. So just keep in mind sort of a general observation that helps to explain why we sort of develop some kind of slightly new techniques as novels continue to gain in popularity. Again, these older works of literature were meant to sort of capture shared ideas or values that existed in those cultures or those societies. Whereas novels, particularly by the 19th century, the 1800s, novels were more focused on capturing life as it was. They were a little more focused on realism and realistic characters. And then by the 20th century, by the 1900s, we had an increased sort of focus and interest in the mental states of characters. So that also drove certain innovations that we can notice. Just a greater focus on the psychological states of characters as psychology became sort of more of an accepted science, and just a little bit more focus on fragmentation, disillusionment. Again, these are sort of aspects of the modern world. A lot of this became more prevalent after the world wars in the first half of the 20th century. Disillusionment. What does it all mean? Characters feeling cut off from society. Increasingly, authors found that first person point of view, or this kind of weird, almost invisible third person point of view, could better capture the sort of modern condition, modern society. It could better, those point of views could better capture it than, say, the omniscient, godlike narrator that was so popular in previous eras, when we seem to have a little more certainty and maybe more shared values. The book talks about how things are more relative now in the modern world. Things are more fragmented. People are more individualized. We're less collective. We're more focused on individuals. And we're certainly focused on our own mental states. So I kind of wanted to show a quick example of this. I know this is running really long, but take a look at the examples of this kind of what we're talking about here with figural narrative situation, and look at the example of sort of a stream of consciousness. They mentioned these modern techniques: stream of consciousness, interior monologue, and free indirect discourse. They give you at least an example from Joyce, I think, of stream of consciousness. Take a look at that. Again, that's a way to try to capture the disordered, fragmented form that people's inner thoughts often take. That's an attempt to sort of capture a mental state in a realistic way. But you couldn't really get that from a traditional omniscient third-person narrator. You couldn't really get that with some of the more traditional styles and techniques. They also mention free indirect discourse, but they don't really give you an example of it. So I wanted to give you an example. Just very quickly from a pretty modern author. I mean, he's dead now, but Elmore Leonard was a pretty popular crime writer in the late 1900s into the early 2000s. You may have seen some movies based on his books. Out of Sight, starring George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez, was based on one of his. Get Shorty with John Travolta. These might ring a bell. But anyway, he's sort of a master of this sort of invisible third-person narrator. And what Leonard is really known for is a technique called free indirect discourse. That's when you can't really tell the difference between the narrator's voice and the voice of a character. So with typical narration, often delivered by a traditional, omniscient third-person narrator, you would get what's called a lot of attribution. Sam said this. John said blank, right? Everything gets attributed to the character, and there's a difference between the narrator's voice and the character's voice. But when you're trying to make the narrator invisible, you do away with some of those attributions, and there's not really a difference that most can notice between the narrator's voice and the voice of a character. So I'm just going to read you a paragraph from a novel by Elmore Leonard. This was written in the 80s, but for our intents and purposes, it's pretty modern. So the protagonist of this book is named Jack. That's all you need to know. Jack had a couple of beers and an oyster loaf at the bar. Talked to Mario on and off about nothing, and in between thought about the guy, Franklin, and his blue steel automatic. That was one weird effing guy. Jack finished eating and drove downtown. So of course I'm bleeping out the curse word, but none of that paragraph is in quotation marks. We're not actually getting dialogue there. And that's the whole point. That's the narrator. That's the narrator talking. That's the narrator describing what Jack's doing and even what Jack's thinking, because that's what we get there with the profanity. That's something Jack is thinking. That's almost like he's talking to himself. And that's very much Jack's voice. Jack curses. Jack's kind of a funny guy. That sounds like Jack. But it's actually not Jack. It's the narrator. But when we do hear the narrator, he sounds just like Jack. There's not really a difference because the whole point is Leonard doesn't want us to notice the narrator. He doesn't want us to notice that the narrator is actually telling the story. He wants everything to sound like the characters, either talking or thinking. But it's interesting, though, because he doesn't use first-person narration, and he does not want an omniscient third-person narrative like the old-fashioned way. So he uses this weird, kind of more modern type of third-person narration, where, yeah, we get a narrator providing us info, but notice that for the most part, it's just the basics. We learn what Jack eats. We learn that he has a couple of beers. He's talking to the bartender. Then he leaves and goes home. And then we hear one of his inner thoughts. But it's all delivered in Jack's voice. And there's not a clear distinction between the narrator and Jack. So that's free indirect discourse. That's just sort of another hallmark of more modern fiction, more modern novels, where we don't always want that obtrusive, omniscient third-person narrator. We still see plenty of works of fiction that have that style of narration, but we also have these other options. Okay, and the final element we'll cover, I'll make it quick, setting. We all know what setting means, but just remember, we're talking about location, we're talking about historical period, and social surroundings that are all potentially important to a text. So the main things that I think you should remember, the main two areas for setting would be temporal. That means the time or the historical period that the text takes place in. And then the other level is physical or geographical, like the actual physical location. So what country are we in? What, state or city? And we can get as specific as we want. What neighborhood, what street, whose house. But there's usually going to be a temporal level to the setting, and then there'll also be a physical or a geographical level. Different authors will reveal different amounts of setting. In some cases, the setting is really important to an overall work of fiction, especially with a Gothic novel. As we said, they rely very heavily on atmosphere, the spooky castle, the middle of the night, rain. Maybe we're in, some European country with a long, troubling history. So, in some cases, the setting really matters. But then in other works of fiction, the setting might not be described in very much detail at all, particularly in short stories. Sometimes a lot of things about the setting might get withheld from us. We might only know little bits and pieces. We might not know the physical setting, exactly. Or we might only have a general idea of the time period. But, you need to be aware of whatever details are provided. And that's it for the key elements of fiction. So just keep those in mind. Plot, character, point of view, we can just use that term, and then finally, setting. But remember that when we start analyzing these elements, when we start writing about literature, we always need to remember that these elements work together. They're all cogs in a larger machine. They're not self-contained units. So when we're analyzing setting, it will be hard to ignore all the others. We need to think about what effect the setting has on character. Or if we're thinking about plot, we need to think about how that interacts or relates to these other elements, setting, character, and point of view, because they're all working together and they're all combining to express the themes, those larger meanings of the text. So we'll talk more about that as we fine-tune our analytical skills, but we always need to think about these as working together, interacting, and trying to create some larger whole. All right, so that's it for week 2. Let me know if you have any questions. And remember, in week 3, we're going to take a look at some examples of fiction. A little bit from epics, mostly from short stories, because we don't have time for novels. But as you're reading through those examples, just look for these different types of point of view. Look for different characters. Look for different kinds of plots, different kinds of plot sequences. And think a little bit about settings as well. So I'll see you next week.